worst thing about it was that it was a murder of a baby. And it was a murder of a little baby in his own home, in his own room, when he was asleep.
It appeared this family had been taken by surprise and murdered. It was probably a murder, probably a contract killing that's killed for hire.
I personally don't feel safe out in the street. I'm a police officer. I carry a gun with me. The streets are dangerous.
He really and truly believed he was a mafia hitman. And he bragged about that to several people.
Someone walked in and shot him twice, once in the chest and once in the head. He died at the scene.
30-year-old Adon Lozo has just been murdered. It's 1 a.m. outside the El Rio Grande Lounge on Houston Street. To police, it's just another barroom killing, the 165th murder in Houston so far this year. On the average, there's a murder once every 14 hours in Houston, and a third of the victims are killed by absolute strangers.
Beer joint murders, the bar murders, we made them by the groves. Just, they're dropping every night.
That second door, when all them people were running out, you know, that's how he got the blood on it.
As detectives pull together the facts, they learn the killer walked into the bar, gunned down Adon Lozo, and drove off in a red pickup truck.
As best we can determine, there were at least 5 or 6 shots fired. As he fell to the floor, he continued to shoot him as he was on the floor.
This murder has been solved, but each year in Houston, more than 100 murders go unsolved. 1979, the Orchard apartment murders. 5 young people are slain in a series of mysterious killings. One victim's head is nearly severed, and 2 other victims are decapitated.
She had been brutally murdered, and her head was taken. The head has never been recovered.
You got a problem. You got a blood trail that leads all the way to the other end of the apartment project. Where did Lifelight land? Right out here.
May 1985. A Cuban couple is killed at a West Houston apartment complex. Detectives say the murders may be drug-related.
The man was found shot in the head, and he was dead at the scene of a singular gunshot wound. We certainly are looking at robbery or an attempted robbery. We've been told to look in regards to a drug problem that's in and around the area.
October 1984. A 16-year-old girl is abducted and shot to death in the back of her father's truck.
He had a .25 pistol, and he put it up to the girl's head, and at that time told me, "You're going to have to drive me where I want to go."
The girl's boyfriend is also shot and left for dead, but he lives and manages to flag down a police car. The next day, police get a phone call from this pay telephone in Northeast Houston. They think that the mysterious caller may be the killer.
There's 2 dead people in the truck.
Where are they in the truck?
Truck is in the field.
Okay, what kind of truck? It's a pickup truck?
Yes.
Are they in the back, in the front, or where?
In the truck.
It's 2 dead people.
Yes.
How you know they're dead?
This is in the police department out there.
What is your last name?
I cannot give you all that information.
Okay.
Hey,
Uh-huh.
you might want to have the news people there.
March 1982, the Golden Age Nursing Home. A 77-year-old woman, Margaret Barziza, is dragged out of her bed through a window. Outside, she's raped and killed.
She died as a result of the beating that she sustained there in the assault.
August 1983. 3 middle-aged women are killed execution-style in a West Houston real estate office.
My mother was murdered.
All of these killers are still free. This is the county morgue. Do you know what your chances are of ending up here as a murder victim? Well, according to national statistics, the odds are 1 in 133. And if you are killed, your killer may never go to prison. Last year, there were 473 murders in Houston, and more than a third of them are still unsolved.
one of the biggest frustrations of working in the homicide is, you know, knowing how many people get away with murder.
1/3 of them get away with it. And so, in my opinion, I would say that it is easy in some cases to get away with murder.
It is very easy. I think it's probably one of the most easy crimes to commit and get away with if you know how.
And apparently, it might be easier to get away with murder in Houston than in other major cities in Texas. According to the Department of Public Safety, the Houston Police Department solved or cleared 64% of its murder cases last year. Austin cleared 66%, Dallas 73%, Fort Worth 93%.
When you're talking about the murder clearance rate, comparing it to other cities, it would depend on how the other cities report their clearance rate. Some cities, as I have been told, report cases as being cleared if they arrest a suspect. In Houston, we only clear cases when we file charges on a suspect, which means we're ready to go to trial.
Murder cases don't go unsolved in Houston because of lack of manpower or money. Even though the city budget is tight, the Homicide Division spends $5 million a year. That's about $10,000 per murder.
A certain number of cases that the Homicide Division handles, they're just not going to be cleared. You just don't have any evidence. You don't have any witnesses. You don't have anywhere to go. And all the TV sleuths in the world couldn't solve some of those cases down there. You'll still have a certain number of cases that you will not be able to solve. That's just the nature of that business down there.
But that's not much consolation for someone whose loved one has been murdered.
So many go unsolved. So many people, you know, for years and years never know, and they can't prove these things, and there's no justice done. It doesn't take away the hurt, but it's just, people shouldn't have to suffer all of these agonies at somebody else's hand.
Police say at one time, Houston was probably the murder capital of the United States. Literally hundreds, perhaps thousands of murders here have remained unsolved. But there is one case in particular. Even though it happened 20 years ago, homicide detectives are still talking about it because it's the most sensational unsolved murder in Houston history. And it happened right here on Driscoll Avenue. This is where the Rogers house stood. Fred Rogers was 82. His wife, Edwina, was 72. They lived here with their 43-year-old son, Charles. They were not your typical loving family. Charles lived upstairs, alone in the attic, and never talked to his parents.
Nobody ever seen him. Supposedly he would stay in the house upstairs in that room. He'd come and go either at night or early in the morning. He never spoke to his mother or daddy. His mother, I understand, would leave him, slide him notes underneath the door, and they would communicate back and forth this way.
Mike Driscoll was one of the few neighbors who did see Charles Rogers.
I always had the feeling that there was an air of mystery about this man. Primarily the way he would cock his hat and his coat and the way he carried himself didn't lend itself to anyone being able to determine anything about it.
Charles Rogers was a neighborhood mystery. At the University of Houston, he was a brilliant student. But by 1965, he had quit his job as a seismologist, and he was a hermit. Which brings us to the night murder was discovered. June 23rd, 1965. A patrol car was dispatched to the Rogers house when a nephew could not reach them.
The nephew had figured that something had happened to him since he was not able to get a hold of him. And like I said, we went on into the house and started searching through it.
Captain Charles Bullock was then a 29-year-old patrolman. He searched the entire house and found no one. He was getting ready to leave when he opened the refrigerator door.
And when I opened it up, it's, all I could see in it is just meat. Packed in there, fully packed. You couldn't have got anything else in there, I don't think, if you'd wanted to. But I called my partner over and showed my partner. and this is when he made the comment that, you know, apparently somebody just butchered a hog or something. And I started to close the refrigerator. And when I did, I looked down at the vegetable bin, which had a glass top on it, and I seen the heads at that time. So I knew what the rest of it was. At first, I didn't know it was human body cut up. But come to find out it was both of them had been cut up and both of them been placed in the refrigerator.
The bodies of Edwina and Fred Rogers had been dissected in the bathtub with this saw and stuffed in the refrigerator.
It's something that you wouldn't want to see every day. And then to be able to have to take them back out of the refrigerator and put their parts back together and see if all of it's there.
Well, it was later determined that their internal organs were cut up and flushed down the commode into the city sewage system. We got a city crew out, and they unstopped the sewer. It was causing a foul odor in the neighborhood.
An autopsy determined Fred Rogers had been beaten to death with this hammer. Edwina was shot in the head. The weapons were found in the attic bedroom of their son, but Charles Rogers had completely disappeared. Police put out an all-points bulletin for him, but he was never found.
Privately, police believe it was Charles Rogers who killed and butchered his own mother and father on Father's Day 20 years ago. Because he was never found, he was declared legally dead back in 1975. But police think he's still alive, and he was such a hermit, he may even still be living here in Houston. Houston's murder rate is up 10% this year. For most of us, those are only statistics. But for every statistic, there's a victim. And for every victim, there's a family. They are the victims left behind.
August 19th, 1983, the day after Hurricane Alicia. 3 middle-aged women are murdered execution style, shot in the head during an apparent robbery at Shoemate Realty. A husband of one of the victims gets a phone call at home.
She said, there's been a shooting over at Shoemate. Somebody is hurt.
Ed Ivy and his daughter, Helen, get to the murder scene in time to see Fran Ivy being brought out on a stretcher.
When they brought her out, we all ran towards her, hoping that we could, hold her hand or touch her or kiss her or something. And they wouldn't let us. They pushed us back.
Ed and Fran Ivy had been married 40 years. Together, they had 6 children.
The night after I got home from the hospital, I got on a long-distance telephone and called every widow and widower I knew in the United States. I wanted to talk to somebody who knew how I was hurting.
Initially, I felt great bitterness that of all the things that you can be robbed of, the greatest robbery of all is a human life.
Charles Shoemate's wife, Elizabeth, was also murdered at the real estate office.
That anyone could take a human life that belongs to that person and to that person's family and just wantonly destroy it. It's incomprehensible to me.
Charles Shoemate still seems haunted by the loss of his wife. Her image is everywhere in his home. And you get the feeling that when her life stopped, so did his.
Until we get it solved, a great deal of my life is still centered around that. It's like reading a book a good book that you get to near the end at some point and you lose the book. You never know what happened.
Shoemate says he was not only stunned by the loss of his wife, he was also shocked by the rumors he began to hear.
The crime was so absolute deliberate that it was suggested that there was mafia elements involved, or that there was a maniac who felt he'd been done an injustice in a real estate transaction. From the very beginning, the only apparent motive was robbery for jewelry.
The scene of the murders, the Shoemate real estate office, used to be here. But as you can see, it's completely gone now. Many of the real estate agents just couldn't return here to the place where their friends had been murdered. The firm used to do $20 million a year in sales, but after the murders, the business collapsed.
A $25,000 reward was offered by the Houston Real Estate Association, and Charles Shoemate spent $20,000 of his own to advertise it, but it went unclaimed. He says until the murders are solved, his life will continue to revolve around finding his wife's killer.
I think the killer should die 3 times, if that were possible.
I firmly believe that the people who did this deserve maximum penalties under the law, and I'd like to see them get it.
You'd like to see them executed?
I let the court decide this. I'm not really sure how I feel about the death penalty. I have mixed feelings.
Ed Ivy's loss could not have been more profound. He and Fran had spent their lives together, raising a close, warm family. 5 months before Fran was killed, her 6 children surprised her with a birthday party and took these pictures.
She had the most friendly smile, and she was everybody's friend. There's not an enemy in the world. That's why whoever did this must not have known who it was, because she was everybody's friend.
How did you cope with the fact that your wife was murdered?
I was lucky. In the car going to the hospital, I had to, thinking about it, makes me sort of cry a bit. I had to face up to the fact that somebody had deliberately and intentionally attempted to kill Fran. And I had a choice. My choice was either to forgive those people or have on my conscience the rest of my life this hatred, this anger. And I made the decision to forgive them.
What bothers you the most? I don't remember if I said goodbye. That morning, when I left for work, she was really tired. We had just had, the hurricane the day before. And I always hugged and kissed both my parents goodbye. But that morning, I cannot remember if I said goodbye.
In fiction, it seems that almost anyone can solve a murder mystery, but in reality, only a few have the experience and luck to crack a case. Now we're going to take a look at 3 very different types of detectives: a detective of the streets, a detective of science and medicine, and a detective of the mind.
I get to do what people go home and watch TV and wish they can do. I go out on a day-to-day basis and I look for people. I investigate murders. The bloody bodies you get used to. You learn to disassociate yourself with those people. I don't want to be emotionally involved. I can't do anything when I'm emotionally involved. I'm a detective. I work murders.
For police homicide detective Jerry Welch, murder is business as usual. It has to be. But there are times when it becomes more than that.
I say that you don't get emotionally involved. I do. I have gotten emotionally involved in several cases. Cases where children are involved are always extremely difficult, especially if you have children of your own, such as I do.
Tracking down a killer does not always mean bringing him to justice. Many times, detectives cannot make an arrest because there isn't enough evidence, and that's their biggest frustration.
Of the unsolved murders that I have, I would say a large portion of them, we pretty well knew who did it.
For example, Welch says he knows who killed businessman Jimmy Shoemake, who was shot in his office last December.
So why can't you go ahead and charge him?
Because at this point, we do not have the physical evidence to make a case in court. you just cannot prove it, and it's extremely frustrating.
Nobody wants to work on a murder case, a whodunit, and not clear it.
Sergeant J.C. Mosier was a homicide detective for 8 years.
In fact, at times it got rather bitter. The needling and the personality conflicts down there sometimes over who could clear a case and who couldn't sometimes gets kind of severe down there. And they take it very seriously, clearing a case.
When I solve the case, there's a tremendous satisfaction there of saying, I did it. Nobody else but I and the other detectives around me took this case and was able to piece it together and make a case and put that person in jail.
This man also solves murders.
The bottom line comes down to babes, booze, and bucks. In other words, it's either a woman or women involved, it's either alcohol and or drugs involved, or it's money involved.
Dr. Joseph Yehemchek is Harris County's highly acclaimed and sometimes controversial medical examiner. During the last 3 decades, he's made Houston's coroner's office into one of the finest in the country, and he's conducted enough autopsies to rival the population of a mid-sized town.
Dr. Yehemchek is such an institution in Houston, this entire county building has been named for him.
Whenever there's a murder, his office investigates it, and he does his detective work in his lab.
They're trying to get the answers, and the answers are not always obvious. They're not always easy to come by. But that dead person tells us, gives us those answers, but not with their voice, with the evidence that is in that body. So the dead body tells us quite a bit. In fact, dead men do tell tales.
But when a murder remains a mystery, baffling both police and the medical examiner, the detective of last resort is psychic John Catchings.
I don't ever get any easy cases. I always get the most difficult ones. A psychic should be a last resort.
Catchings says he's put 3 killers in jail. Channel 26 brought him to Houston recently to help solve another murder.
We've got some bone parts that we cut off. We took to Austin. I called the medical family this morning to see about, picking them up in case she wanted to hold them or something.
Sometime last year, a young woman was killed, and her torso was found in this field near Hockley. Detectives have no idea who she was.
The torso was discovered a year ago by a woman picking berries. It was buried in this shallow grave, wrapped in these 2 plastic bags, and it had been severed at the waist and hips.
We're just hoping that Mr. Catchings can come up with something that help us identify her.
I got a little bit of a feeling over here a while ago when we went back the first time.
Catchings led detectives Ronnie Phillips and Earl Bokel to another spot 2 miles away, where he thinks the rest of the woman's body is buried. To see if he's right, the investigators plan to return here soon with shovels.
A saw, like maybe a hacksaw used. Maybe just a regular old wood saw also used.
Holding the bags the torso was buried in, Catchings described the murder scene, the woman, and her killer to Channel 26 news photographer and artist Jerry Lane.
I think he was a wavy-haired person with broad forehead and a very bushy mustache. Our victim, I pick up very tanned complexion with freckles and shoulder-length, straight, brown hair.
Using Catchings' description, the detectives have come up with a possible suspect whom they're now investigating. They take the psychic seriously, but they didn't always.
I guess I was like a lot of other people. I was unbelieving. Thought it was a bunch of baloney.
What changed your mind?
Gail Lorky's case.
32-year-old Gail Lorky was reported missing by her husband 2 years ago. Gail's sister contacted Catchings.
Immediately, I had a very strong feeling that there was foul play involved in here and that she was not alive and that she had been murdered.
Catchings said Gail had been strangled by her husband after a dance lesson. He said her body was under some debris near a well. All of his predictions were true. Her husband, Steve Lorky, has confessed and is now in prison.
If it were not for Catchings' involvement, what do you think the status of this case would be right now?
It would probably be still handled as a missing persons report.
Had it not been for John Catchings, my sister would have still been lying out there. The man would be free.
gives you goose pimples, to be truthful with you. Just unreal.
So far, we've been talking about unsolved murders. But now we'd like to tell you about 4 murders that would have remained unsolved if not for the stubborn determination of one Houston homicide detective. As the story unravels, you'll see how complicated and tangled a murder plot can be.
It was the type of murder scene dreaded by even the most hardened homicide detective. A family of 3 had been killed execution style. 35-year-old John Wansrath was found dead in the family den, shot twice in the back of the head. His wife, Diana, lay 10 feet away, shot in the right temple. But the worst sight was down the hall in the nursery. 1-year-old Kevin Wansrath had also been murdered while sleeping in his crib.
This was a baby laying in the crib that had been shot in the head. It was probably one of the most horrible things I'd ever seen.
Detective Johnny Bonds wondered why anyone would kill the Wansraths. They were a typical family. John was a successful scientist, an oceanographer, the absent-minded professor type. Diana was a housewife.
She was a very vivacious, outgoing person who had a knack of making all of her friends feel like they were her best friend.
Their son, 14-month-old Kevin, was adopted.
Their lives had so much potential. John was very intelligent. John had a good job. John was looking forward to a bright future. Diana was always looking forward to a bright future, and Kevin was the ultimate in their lives. There was nothing better could have happened to them. They had waited for so long for that baby.
Ann Lesh and Ellen Davidson had been 2 of Diana's closest friends since high school. And perhaps more than anyone, they were outraged by the brutal murders.
When a friend, another mutual friend, called and said on the phone, I'll never forget her words. She said, "There's been an accident and Diana and John and Kevin are dead." And the most tremendous sense of anger, can you believe, came over me. But then when she said they'd been shot, it was, I remember screaming at her, why? And I just, until my husband took the phone, that's all I could scream. I wanted her to tell me why.
Johnny Bonds set out to find out why, and the case would become his obsession.
It appeared that it was probably a murder, probably a contract killing, a kill for hire. It appeared this family had been taken by surprise and murdered.
But the county medical examiner thought otherwise. Even though no gun was found in the house, he ruled the deaths murder-suicide, saying that Diana shot her husband and her baby and then killed herself.
Diana was not a candidate for suicide. She just could never have been.
And then how about the fact that it went even further, that they put her in as the murderer?
Well, it was absurd.
They, from everything that I could see, were, I'd say, a happier than normal couple. It just didn't fit.
On the data that we had available to us and the exhaustive investigation by a very eminent, qualified consultant, again, led me to rule the way we did. The only thing that was not classic was the fact that the death weapon was not there. That in and of itself, however, is not at all unusual, because we've seen and heard of a number of cases where an expensive gun in particular is carried off by whoever first finds the body.
Dr. Janecka is a well-respected medical examiner. He's one of the best, probably the best. But he didn't do this autopsy. Somebody else did in his office, and declared it was a suicide, and it wasn't.
Ted Poe was the assistant district attorney who would eventually handle the case. But right now, because of the coroner's ruling, there was no case.
And so we were having the problems of taking on the best medical examiner in the United States. And it was the word of a hard-nosed, tough cop versus the ME's office here.
I couldn't believe it was being ruled the way it was, and I took it somewhat as a personal challenge and also kind of as an insult. And I felt like I had to prove I was right.
The case haunted Johnny Bonds, and he worked relentlessly to prove the family was murdered. He tracked down every possible clue. He interviewed hundreds of people. But several months of investigation only led to roadblocks and dead ends. He found nothing that led to murder.
I had several of them tell me I was kicking a dead horse. You know, it'd be better if I just forgot about it.
But he couldn't just forget about it. Diana's friends wouldn't let him.
She had friends that were more upset about these murders than most of the time families are, than husbands or wives or fathers or daughters, or, you know, than immediate family were. I mean, 6 or 8 months later, they're still calling me, wanting to know what's happening, and begging me not to give up, not to quit.
And then there was little Kevin, who looked so much like his own son. Why would anyone kill a baby? Slowly, the reason became clear. Because Kevin was an heir, and somebody else wanted to inherit the family's estate. The prime suspect became Markham Duff Smith, Diana's adopted brother. He inherited $350,000 from Diana. But was he capable of killing his own family? The family he posed with for pictures the night before they were murdered?
He didn't give the impression of as being the kind of person who would have people killed until we located an ex-girlfriend, approximately 3 weeks or a month after the murders took place. She told us that he had approached her about a year before and tried to talk her into having her husband killed so she could receive his inheritance, a large sum of money, that he would invest it for her and she'd never have to work again. So once we found out that he did have the capability of doing something like this, there was no doubt in my mind he's one that had it done.
He had everything to gain by these people dying, by collecting their estates. Duff Smith was the man behind all of the plotting and scheming and paying of the money to have everybody killed.
And when Duff Smith plotted and schemed, he did it with his best friend, Walt Waldhauser.
Waldhauser, for some unknown reason, was fascinated with organized crime. He liked to talk about his connections with the family or with the mafia and what he could have done.
But in reality, Waldhauser's mafia connections were only fantasies.
I felt like Duff Smith definitely was behind the plot. I felt like Waldhauser was involved some way. I did not know how deeply he was involved, but I didn't think either one of them were the actual killers. So we needed a criminal type. We needed someone we felt was capable of actually pulling the trigger on these people. And in November of 1980, came up with Alan Janecka's name.
Bonds got the name of the trigger man, Alan Janecka, from these letters Walt Waldhauser left behind with his wife after a messy divorce.
Once we found out who to ask about and started checking up on him, everything just fell in place.
Alan Janecka, the professional hitman. As a youth, he was an altar boy, a high school sports star and homecoming king. But by 1979, he was an ex-con who bragged that he was a contract killer.
He really and truly believed he was a mafia hitman. I compare him to a loaded gun. He is a very dangerous person in the right hands. He was easily influenced. You could talk him into doing anything.
The job of tracking down Alan Janecka went to Detective Dan McAnulty, who teamed up with Bonds as the investigation finally gained momentum. He heard that Janecka was living in Georgia and went there to find him.
And it was then that an amazing thing happened. Dan McAnulty found the murder weapon, the same gun used to kill John, Diana, and Kevin.
We had no idea that it still was in existence. We assumed it had probably been destroyed.
Alan Janecka was gone, but he had left the gun, a Colt 22, with his girlfriend, and Dan McAnulty somehow had to talk her out of it.
It finally came down to her saying, well, you're going to have to tell me how you know I have a gun. And I said, what about if I just do this, Karen? I said, how about if I tell you not only that you have a gun, but I'll write down on a piece of paper what kind of a gun it is, what caliber, and what it looks like. And she says, okay, do it. So I wrote down Colt 22 caliber Frontier Scout revolver. At that point, Karen said, okay, I've got the gun, I'll go get it. It was a fully loaded pistol, and it was exactly what we were looking for from ballistics tests that had been performed on the bullet that killed Kevin Wanstraw.
Through the girlfriend, the detectives then found Alan Janecka and arrested him. 6 days later, he confessed. In his confession, Janecka said that on the night of the murders, he went to the Wansroth home with Walt Waldhauser. They brought along a gift, these bottles of wine. Diana knew Walt. He was a family friend. After a few moments inside, Janecka shot John Wansroth twice in the back of the head. As Diana screamed, Waldhauser sprayed her with mace and forced her to the floor. Janecka shot her in the head. Then he went down the hall and into the nursery. Kevin Wansroth was the last to die. This is part of Alan Janecka's confession.
Yeah, I went down and did my thing. The man got shot first, the lady second, and then the baby. Okay. Now, you shot twice at him, in other words? Yes, I just went.
Probably the worst thing about it was that it was a murder of a baby. And it was a murder of a little baby in his own home, in his own room, when he was asleep. And the people who did it had gotten away with it for a long time.
But those were not the only murders the killers had gotten away with. As the plot unfolded, it was revealed that they had had someone else killed, and they were planning even more murders. Our story will continue in a moment. After a year-long murder investigation, Alan Janecka finally confessed to being the hired killer who shot Kevin Wansroth and his parents.
With that confession, police were able to arrest the man who murdered the family with him, Walt Waldhauser. Waldhauser also confessed. And he told police he and Duff Smith not only had the family killed, they had a hit list of people they were planning to murder next. Johnny Bond's name was on it.
It would have surprised me if they hadn't discussed it, because they knew I was still asking questions and snooping around.
But the series of murders did not end there. Waldhauser told police that Duff Smith had also had someone else killed in this River Oaks mansion 4 years earlier, his own mother.
Gertrude Zibolio was found dead on the bathroom floor, strangled with a pair of pantyhose. Her death was also ruled a suicide, and Duff Smith inherited $80,000. $10,000 of that went to Alan Janecka, once again the hired killer. But Janecka did not act alone in that murder. He had an accomplice named Paul.
Well, it couldn't have been done by one person. And as it turned out, I wound up driving the car, dropped Alan off, and later picked him up.
We've agreed not to use Paul's last name as a condition of this interview. He says his involvement in the mother's murder all started with a phone call from an old friend, Walt Waldhauser.
He knew that I was in need of money and asked me if I could take care of a job. He told me that a friend of his wanted to get rid of his family for the insurance money, for the estate. I was on probation at the time and needed $5,000 to get off probation. And then later, as I started to back away from it, I knew too much to really back away from it. And my family was threatened if I didn't follow through. I got a call one day and said that I didn't know who it was. I'd never heard the voice before. They said, you know, if you don't go through with this, I wouldn't want my wife to go out and start the car in the morning. You just never know what could happen.
So, on the night of the murder, Paul drove Alan Janecka to the Zibolio home. Now, the original plan was for Janecka to kill both Mrs. Sabolio and her husband, but it turned out that her husband was out of the country. Later that night, Janecka told Paul what he had done.
She had told him that her husband was due back at any time. And so he kept putting things off and putting things off, hopefully until the husband returned. And they had just talked. They were up in her bedroom. In fact, sitting on the bed, he told me, talking about everything, that, how she was concerned about this might happen and that she was afraid of her stepson. He got tired of waiting, and he told her, he said, I've got to get out of here, and I'm here to do a job. And she said she understood, and apparently she had turned her back on him, and he put the stocking around her neck and strangled her, and then dragged her into the bathroom.
For 5 years, Paul lived with that murder, and he says during that whole time he was filled with overwhelming guilt.
I still feel it. I'm sorry for what happened. I'll never be able to get away from it. I spent 5.5 years looking over my shoulder until I was arrested. And when I was arrested, it was like a tremendous weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Let's go. Let's get on with it. That's behind me now.
Paul is probably one of the most unusual people I've ever dealt with in a murder case, especially one that's as complicated, a conspiracy such as this. From the time I met him, he was very straightforward about what he wanted to do. He wanted to get this straight. He wanted to help us, and he didn't want to die. We never caught him telling one falsehood. He was completely honest the first time with everything he told us.
With help from Paul, Bonds finally had the proof he needed to arrest the man who arranged to have his entire family murdered, Markham Duff Smith. Detective McAnulty took these pictures.
I'd been wanting to put this guy in jail for 1.5 years, and finally got a chance to do it. We finally had a warrant, and I had to fight myself. I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling.
As the case went to trial, right here in this courtroom, Duff Smith tried one last maneuver to outsmart everyone, and it almost worked. He lined up several witnesses who agreed to lie for him, to say that he was being framed. But one of his witnesses, a convict named Jerry Eichenhorst, dropped a bombshell. He told the jury everything. And they offered this as proof. It's a letter written by Duff Smith instructing Jerry Eichenhorst exactly what to say on the stand.
And they were shocked when he turned the tables on them and told them that, no, this was all made up by Duff Smith. He told me what to say, and I'm not going to do it. And then on cross-examination, we produced the transcript, or the letter. And that was the only time in the whole trial where Markham Duff Smith lost his composure. And he did. He could not believe that piece of paper showed up in the courtroom.
Today, Duff Smith and his hitman, Alan Janecka, are both on death row. But Duff Smith still says he's innocent. In his first contact with the press since his conviction, Duff Smith told Channel 26 News the man really behind all the killings is Walt Waldhauser. In this letter, he wrote, "No matter what you or others have heard or read or think about me, I'm no criminal or killer. And most importantly, I loved my mother, my sister, my godson Kevin, and my brother-in-law John."
Markham Duff Smith, in my opinion, was an arrogant individual who believed he could convince anybody of anything.
I think Duff Smith kind of lived in a dream world. This guy, and of all the people involved in this, he's the only one I think that really felt justified in this whole thing. He felt right in killing his mother and killing his sister. He felt like he was owed a living, owed money.
As for the others involved in the murder plots, Paul got 16 years in prison. He was released after 3.5 years. Walt Waldhauser was sentenced to 30 years. He will probably serve only 12.
People shouldn't have to suffer all of these agonies at somebody else's hand. And Markham deserves to suffer, Alan Janecka and Walter Wallhauser, all of them. They all deserve to suffer. And having the case solved was important because it saved a little bit of my sanity.
As for Johnny Bonds, a book has been written about him, The Cop Who Wouldn't Quit.
I felt vindicated. I don't know whether I had a right to feel that way or not, but I felt like, you know, I proved what I wanted to prove.
If not for Johnny Bonds and his partner, Dan McAnulty, those 4 murders would be like the others we've seen tonight, unsolved. Murder is a sad fact of life and death. It's been around since Cain slew Abel, but even so, it's hard to imagine how one person can kill another. It is the most violent crime and the most devastating, and it is surprisingly easy to get away with. I'm Jocelyn Lane.